Kia ora, and welcome to our first Immigration Advisors Authority webinar for the year. As usual, just give us maybe another minute while people are still joining the session, and then we'll get underway very shortly. And so we've still got plenty of people coming through. My computer keeps beeping in the background, so bear with us. We're given a roughly 2-minute grace, so I'll get us underway. Again, welcome everyone for our first webinar of the year, hosted by the Immigration Advisors Authority for new advisors. Firstly, just to introduce myself, I'm Duncan Connor, Registrar for Immigration Advisors. I'm joined by a panel from my team here, part of MB, and they'll introduce themselves when they come up to speak about today's topic, or answer some of the questions at the end. Obviously, today's focus is on written agreements, and I'll come to the agenda very, very shortly. I'll get some housekeeping out of the way. So firstly, this webinar is recorded. So if you want to re-watch the content, or you have colleagues that haven't been able to join us today, we'll soon after today's webinar be publishing this online. So keep an eye out for that. And as usual, we share the link to the webinar, any material that we couldn't get to today, or some of the written material, we share that in our next newsletter, which comes out soon after the webinar. So please keep an eye out for that. Of course, you've got the big disclaimer on the front there. None of the information provided in today's webinar should be taken as legal advice. This really is intended information to help your awareness as immigration advisors, as professionals, and help you with your day job, but it's certainly not legal advice. We always encourage you to seek your own independent legal advice should you have the need to. Of course, you can recognize attendance today at the webinar, or reviewing the recorded content as part of your CPD hours. Please just keep a record and capture details of your attendance for record keeping purposes, and you can submit that when it comes to your licensing renewal process. We do have the question and answer function enabled today, which is pretty normal practice for us. You will see it's on the top of the screen for me. I'm hoping everyone else has a similar view. You should see the little Q&A button. It's got a question mark next to it. There's opportunity to submit questions as we go through. We do have our panelists have access to those questions, and we will do our best live. We've got a few of us on today. We'll be trying to get through as many written answers live, and then we have dedicated time at the end of today's session where we'll try and again verbally answer some of the questions. We do tend to prioritize the questions that come through to focus on ones that are relevant to today's subject, and we do tend to always be oversubscribed with the questions. So if we don't get the chance to answer all the questions today, we do endeavour to answer them either directly to you, or for the benefit of the profession as a whole, get back to the group as part of our follow-up information that gets posted. So please use that function, send it through, and we'll, like I say, try and get through them live, and we'll have opportunity at the end to cover as many questions as we can. Been saying that we always are well oversubscribed, so please don't be offended if we don't get to your questions. Now, I'll just touch on today's agenda relatively briefly. So it's on screen there. I'm not going to read it out line by line. but you're really focused on written agreements, as you see there. We're also going to share some of the observations from our recent work piloting a different approach for proactive inspections. From my perspective, that's been a really insightful and successful pilot. And I do just want to take the opportunity now to really thank the specific immigration advisors that participated in this process as a pilot. Like I say, it's been really, really insightful for us from an authority perspective. Today, we're going to share some early observations. We've got a bit more work to do to analyze some of those observations and shape this as a ongoing program. But like I say, really, really insightful and really, really value those of you that participated in that. So thank you very much from my perspective as registrar. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Tiki, who's our first presenter today, and he'll take you through the opening content. Thank you, Tiki.
Well, thanks, Duncan. So my name's Tiki. I'm a senior technical advisor within the MBA Occupational Regulation team. As Duncan said, so today we're going to be primarily looking at written agreements. To try and keep this engaging, what I'll do is I'll pose some questions to you throughout today's webinar. Given the number of us here today, it's not going to be practical for me to seek a response, but I hope that, as you're watching, you'll have a think about what your answers might be, and then we can sort of discuss them. All right, so without further ado, why does this matter? I think when we're told to do something, we tend to ask why. So let's start by having a look at why a strong understanding of written agreements is important. Okay, so getting the obvious out of the way, to be issued an immigration advisor license, you need to meet the competency standards, and the most relevant of these for our discussion today is going to be competency standard 6.7, which you can see on the slide. Okay, so in essence, right, this requires you to be able to create clear and understandable written agreements. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Right, once you're licensed, you need to follow the requirements of the Code of Conduct, which, among other things, includes providing a written agreement to the client and, of course, ensuring that the agreement contains certain information. So we'll spend most of today looking at these particular requirements in a little bit more detail. Okay, so while the regulatory requirements they're probably reason enough, let's try and go a step further. So written agreements, I think they're really the foundation for that relationship of confidence and trust that you build with a client. And what I've put on the slide here is just something to think about, okay? When you last contracted someone to perform a service for you, what is it that you wanted to know? And I'm guessing, at the very least, you wanted to know what work was going to be performed, how much it was going to cost, and probably how long it was going to take, right? So with that information, you knew what to expect from the service. Again, that's what a code-compliant written agreement that you've explained to the client achieves, right? It sets the expectations for the professional relationship. And without having these clear expectations, the chance for sort of a mismatch between what the client thinks will happen and what you think will happen is far greater. And that's where in the past, we've seen some advisors running into some trouble. Okay, so to finish off this section, let's take a look at what the tribunal thinks. So the quote you see on the slide here is a very good summary of this. Okay, the requirements around written agreements, they're not just paper shuffling requirements, they are important, as the tribunal noted, for the client, but also, as we just discussed on the previous slide, for yourself. Okay, and we can also see this importance reflected in the number of complaints that involve breaches of the code requirements around written agreements. So since 1 July 2024, okay, we've actually had 17 sanctions decisions involving a breach of Clause 18, and within these decisions, Clause 18 was was breached the most often, followed by 18B and then 18C. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is recap some of the core requirements for written agreements, and I'm sure that you are familiar with these, but I think it's useful to go over some points given the complaint numbers that we just spoke about. Okay, clause 18a, so we already mentioned it, right? You need to provide the client with a written agreement. I mean, that sounds simple enough. Let's look at the clause a little more closely. And I've put a couple of words there in bold, okay, that I'd like you to consider. Client and, proceed. So what do these mean? They define who you need to have a written agreement with and when you need to put one in place. So my colleague Katie's section of today's webinar will touch a little bit on the meaning of client, and we are going to have a look at proceed now. Okay, so the graphic that you can see on the slide over here, that represents what I'd call, I guess, a fairly common business model, right? You discuss the client's circumstances, you give them some preliminary advice, and then they decide, whether to engage you or not. Now, the code of conduct provides some flexibility in terms of how much work is involved in an initial consultation. Could be as simple as 15-minute phone call, maybe more involved. For example, you may wish to view some of the client's documents. Yeah, where you can run into some issues is where you venture into some of the more substantive work before providing a written agreement. So for example, preparing the majority of an application and only providing a written agreement just before the application is ready to be submitted. Okay, so while the code offers some flexibility, right, around what makes for an initial consultation, once that fact-finding stage of work is done, generally it's time to put a written agreement in place. And I've got a quote on the slide here from a recent tribunal decision, which really emphasizes this point, okay, that an agreement needs to be in place. That's the expected standard before any substantive work is carried out. Before I move on, just a quick little aside, as I think this is not sort of a bad place for it. I imagine that most of you have, dealt with and you're going to continue to deal with urgent immigration matters. It's part of working in this industry. And as we've been talking about the timing of things, I just encourage you, to be mindful of how you handle urgent cases and to not skip steps, right? The urgency of a matter doesn't relieve you from your code responsibilities. Okay, clause 18b, so an LIA must ensure that before any written agreement is accepted, they explain all the significant matters in the written agreement to the client. So one question that we frequently get is, well, what does this mean? What are significant matters? And this is another example of a clause where the code does provide some flexibility. Okay, and for that reason, I'm not going to provide you with a rigid list of what is or is not significant. However, as a guide, right, I'll just point you to what I said earlier, and that's asking yourself, what do you want to know when somebody contracts you? Right, the work that's going to be done, costs, timeframes. These are some of the most important things that you'll want to set expectations around. In terms of how, right, how you go about explaining the significant matters to your clients, I'm assuming that most of you are now familiar with the first tribunal decision listed on the slide. The outcome of that being that the tribunal stated, right, that this explanation of significant matters, it's got to be verbal, okay, and it needs to be done personally by the licensed advisor. So given these requirements, I think the natural question that arises is, what sort of record or records are you keeping of your compliance with clause 18b of the code? And in relation to this, I'll just point you to the second decision here that I have on the slide, which is quite a recent one. And that says that including a generic statement or a template statement in your written agreement that you've done this, that might not be enough, and that there should be some actual evidence of this having been done. Okay, so what sort of evidence? To answer that, I'd probably point you to clause 26C of the code. Okay, that requires you to confirm in writing to the client the details of any material discussions that you have with them. All right, so continuing on to clause 18C. An LIA must ensure that all parties to a written agreement sign it or confirm in writing that they accept it. So a few different things to unpack with this one. And to help with that, I've got a question on the slide. So what I'll do now is I'll just give you maybe 30 seconds to a minute to read that and to come up with your own answer, and then we'll go through it. All right, so I'll just pause for a little bit. Okay, hopefully you've had time to read and digest that. So when we're talking about clause 18C, I think the first thing to unpack is, who are all parties? Okay, what does this mean? Who does this mean? Okay, the visa applicant is always going to be a client, must be party to the written agreement. So if we're looking at this particular scenario, okay, that's the elderly migrant. Yeah, so option A, having someone else sign the agreement on behalf of the visa applicant, well, unless that person happens to have power of attorney, that's not really going to be a code compliant option. Okay, the second thing to remember about clause 18C, and this really goes for all clauses of the code, is that personal responsibility that you have as a licensed advisor. Okay, so reading the clause and LIA, a licensed immigration advisor, okay, must ensure. So if we look at option D over there, you're kind of opening yourself up to quite a bit of risk. And I've linked a tribunal decision here on the slide, which you might like to read in your own time, that illustrates this. So that leaves us with options B and C, both of which are acceptable. Okay, option B involving complying with the code requirements, and option C recognizing that, hey, where a client's circumstances do not allow you to comply with the code, that's just not a case that you can take on. All right, we'll take a quick look at clause 18D now before moving on to the next part of the webinar. So this clause requires you to record any changes to a written agreement and ensure these are accepted in writing. Okay, so the question I've put on the slide there is, what sort of changes might occur, and there's plenty of answers you can come up with, right? If you're no longer going to perform part of your services, that's going to be a change. If your fee is changing from X amount to Y amount, that's a change. If you identify a new potential conflict of interest, that's a change. Okay, and look, this clause, it's not going to be relevant in all cases, but some of you will deal with immigration matters that last a long time or where multiple complications arise. And it's with those matters in particular that you're going to want to keep clause 18D in mind. Okay, so for the next part of the webinar, we'll take a closer look at some of the mandatory content for written agreements. And I just have to emphasize what Duncan said at the start, right? This is just information to act as a bit of guidance around what might make a written agreement clear and understandable. And it's not legal advice, nor is it a substitute for legal advice. Okay, so clause 19, I've mentioned flexibility a couple of times today when talking about the code. This is one of the more prescriptive clauses of the code. It says that at a minimum, your written agreement has to have all of the following. Now, unfortunately, with some of our inspections, we do see written agreements where these requirements haven't been met very well, or maybe they haven't been met at all. And to help you meet these requirements, for those of you who may not be aware already, the authority does have some additional guidance around clause 19. Okay, and I've put a link to this on the slide. So for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on description of services, disbursements, payment terms, and also the refund policy. Okay, so I've been talking for quite a while, so what we'll do is we'll have a little bit of an exercise for you now. Okay, on the slide is a sample description of services that's based on a real agreement from one of our inspections. So again, I'm just going to pause the webinar for a minute or so, and I'd like you to read the clause and think about the main improvements that you would make. All right, so I appreciate I'm not giving you a lot of time to think these through, but hopefully you're able to identify a few points, and please bear with me for the next part. It's going to be a little bit long-winded, so let's start with the first sentence here. Okay, we will provide you with a copy of the Licensed Immigration Advisor's Professional Standards and explain this document to you. All right, so you're required to do this by clauses 17A and B of the code. But if we think about the timing of this, then when does this have to be done? Yeah, well, it has to be done before entering into a written agreement with the client. Okay, so by including this, we're asking the client to agree to us performing a service that's already been completed. We most often see this with initial consultations, where the advisor undertakes the consultation before entering into the written agreement, but then records the consultation as being a part of their services. So in doing so, they're asking the client to agree to a service and potentially be charged for a service that's already been performed. Okay, the second point here, it's a pretty minor one, but if we're talking about agreements being clear and understandable, I think it's worth pointing out. And okay, and let's just recommend that you explain acronyms fully, particularly when you're dealing with a layperson, rather than leave any sort of room for misinterpretation. The third point that I've got is just to remember that clause 19E requires the service description to be tailored to the client's circumstances. Okay, this is a written agreement for an accredited employer work visa only. Okay, so there's no partner involved. Now, the issue in this example is a very small one, but if we think bigger picture, okay, and we think real life, okay, of course, you're going to have template agreements. Of course, you're going to reuse material across different clients. At the end of the day, you need to make sure that these templates and that this reused material is appropriate for that particular client and to make any changes as needed. Okay, the final point that I've got here is probably the one that stands out the most in this example, and that's the description of services. It could use some more detail so that it is a full description of services. And again, if we try to think practically, right, when preparing your own agreements, I think a question you might find helpful to ask yourself is, right? What are the individual tasks that you're going to be performing as part of the client's immigration matter? So if we look at the sample clause on the slide, we can see review documents, provide advice, send a checklist, submit the application, monitor progress, and confirm material discussions. Sure, yeah, these are some of the services that you're likely to provide, but more can be done to establish those expectations that we spoke about at the start of today's session. For example, are you going to help the client obtain their overseas police certificate? Now, look, I'm not suggesting that you have to go into the absolute minutia, but I think more detail than what you see in this example could really help you ensure that your written agreement is clear and understandable for clients. Okay, related to this final point, it's also quite helpful to establish what you're not going to be performing. So as an example, if we think about a PPI response, okay, from looking at this clause, there's no way to know if this would be included as part of the provided services if it came up. Yeah, and again, I come back to that word expectations. Right? It's helpful to define upfront what will happen if something unexpected occurs, and particularly so right, in an industry such as this one, right, where let's face it, you deal with situations that can be quite high stress, and so managing those expectations is really quite key. All right, well, hopefully I didn't lose you halfway through that rambling, but in case I did, here is a summary of what I just said, which you can refer to in your own time. So for now, we will move on to disbursements. Okay, so on this slide, I have what I'm hoping is a straightforward question. So I'll give you probably 15 to 20 seconds to come up with your answer, and then I will continue. All right. Yep. So it's not a trick question, and I'm sure that some of you may be thinking, why is he asking me this? Well, the answer to that is that we've seen a little bit of misunderstanding in this area. So the point of the question is to just help establish what makes for a disbursement. Okay, and this is a slight oversimplification, but essentially, right, a disbursement is just a non-service fee cost that's going to be associated with the client's immigration matter. Okay, so all of these, any of these could be disbursements. So now that we've established that, okay, let's just remind ourselves what the code requires. Okay, if we look at clause 19G, there are two things that are needed. Okay, one, you need to list the likely disbursements that the client's going to incur in relation to the immigration matter. And what we sometimes see when reviewing written agreements is that the INZ application fee is recorded, but nothing else, when in fact there are other costs there that need to be listed. The other thing that we sometimes see is that the amount or a reasonable estimate is not provided. And that's actually the second requirement of clause 19G. So the code also requires you to be clear about who. Okay, who is paying the disbursement? That's clause 19H. Usually it's going to involve one of the following, right? The client paying directly, the client providing you with their credit card details, or you paying on behalf of the client and then seeking reimbursement. And that last option could also involve an advance payment, depending on how you handle it. Okay, the final point I've got on this slide, it's not really a requirement, it's just something you might like to record, and that's the date, right, at which the disbursement amounts you quoted are correct, because these amounts could be subject to change. And I bring this up, right, I'm sure this will be fresh in all of your minds. Okay, there's significant changes to the INZ fees that happened last year. Okay, payment terms. So there's a lot of different ways you could potentially write a payment terms clause if we think back to competency standard 6.7, right, we want written agreements, hopefully, to be clear and understandable. And so what I've put on the slide here is 4 questions that a client should be able to easily answer when reading your written agreement. Okay, the first of these is who's paying. Okay, this is important when you've got more than one party to the agreement, or if you have multiple agreements with different parties in relation to the same immigration matter. Okay, the second question there is, what dollar amount corresponds to each stage of work? And you may have heard of the concept of matching your stages of work to your payment milestones, and that's exactly what this question is referring to. Okay, so I've provided a straightforward example of this on the slide. Let's say, you have a total service fee of $2,000. Okay, you might have a first stage of work, which includes everything that's involved up until the point you submit the application, and you might decide that the value of that work is $1,500. Okay, and then all the work you complete after you submit the application up until a decision is received, you might designate that as stage 2 work, and you might value that at $500. Okay, the point being, there's a clear breakdown of your total service fee and how it corresponds to the work being performed. Now, the third and the fourth questions. Okay, these are related, and you'll see on the slide that I've also posed the question, how are payments in advance different? And I think it's particularly important to distinguish between these two timings over here in your written agreements when you're dealing with payments in advance. Okay? Because when you expect to receive the payment and when you will issue the invoice is not going to be the same. Okay? And I'd just like to have a look at a scenario to help explain this a little further. All right, so as before, please just have a read, and I'll give you a minute or so to think about your answer with the emphasis on, why or why not. Okay, hopefully you arrived at the conclusion that this is not fully code compliant. In terms of why, I'll jump to the next slide to help with that. Okay, so what you see on this slide is an illustration of the steps involved with taking a payment in advance, which hopefully you are already familiar with, but I think a quick reminder shouldn't hurt. Okay, so you can see from this, right, the initial step is to agree on terms, which you presumably would record in your written agreement, and then to request payment, but not send an invoice. Okay? After the client makes payment into your client account, then you complete the relevant work, and it's at this point that you invoice the client, right? Once you've completed the associated work, finally transfer the client's money from the client account to your practice account as payment for the services that you've rendered. Okay, so with that said, let's jump back to the scenario on the previous slide. Okay, if it wasn't before, hopefully it's clear to you now, okay, what's gone wrong in this particular scenario. So number one, let's have a look at the timing of this invoice. Okay, so we've had an invoice issued after the initial consultation, but before any work on the client's application has been done. Okay, so at the time the invoice was issued, only $250 worth of work has been completed. Okay, so that's the amount that should have been invoiced at that point in time. The $2,000 for preparing a visa application, that's money received in advance of work having been completed. Okay, so why am I explaining all of this? Well, if we think back to these two timings, okay, that I mentioned before to ensure clarity in your written agreement payment terms. While you can expect, request to receive payment from the client ahead of completing the work, okay, you won't invoice them until the work is done, and you should distinguish between these timings in your payment terms when you are dealing with payments in advance. All right. There is a second issue with this scenario, which you may have noted, and that is that client funds have been received into the practice account. Okay, if you have a look at clause 25C of the code, you'll see that any mixed funds, and that means those that relate to both completed work and work that's not yet completed, should first be deposited into the client account, and then the portion that relates to completed work, in this case $250, should be invoiced for and transferred to the practice account. All right. Last little bit from me, and then I will hand you over to Katie. So refunds, same deal as before. If you could have a read, and I will again give you a short amount of time to think about your answer, and then I'll continue. Okay, let's work through each of these. So, A, we will not provide you with a refund if you have provided false information to us. So while this might appear to be fair at first glance, the tribunal has on a number of occasions explained that these sort of no refund statements do not meet the requirements of clause 24A of the code. In terms of B, right, if you terminate this agreement prior to the completion of our services, we will be entitled to be paid a non-negotiable minimum of 20% of the total service fee. I would encourage you to read this decision over here that I've linked on the side, which featured this sort of clause and where the tribunal found the advisor in breach of clause 24A. And that leaves us with C. C effectively states that an advisor is entitled to be paid for work that they've completed. This isn't really a refund policy in and of itself, but it does allow for flexibility, okay, which, given tribunal decisions, I'd probably say is the key takeaway for your own refund policies. Okay, having a refund policy that's flexible, that ensures that you're not predetermining the client's entitlement to a refund, and that you are instead considering refund requests on a case-by-case basis. All right, thanks for listening, and over to you, Katie.
Ngā mihi nui tiki. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Katie Holland toku ingoa. I'm one of the principal investigation officers with the authority, and I'm also one of the team who had the pleasure of engaging with the advisors who are part of our trial group. So ngā mihi nui to those advisors for their face-to-face engagement with us. This was also the opportunity for us to inspect in person, and also for these advisors to have an opportunity to ask us questions or raise any issues or matters they wanted to with us. Just as a bit of a reminder as to what this was, we covered it in our November newsletter, and it just kind of explained that we were trialling a proactive inspection model using our powers under the Act to carry out site inspections with advisors at their premises. Now, first of all, I'm going to move along to cover some of the industry insights that we obtained during our visits, namely one key one around engaging with intermediaries. So we're talking about your recruitment advisors and your employers when you might also be working for the employee. One of the issues raised with us was that there are a number of kind of middlemen, such as recruitment agents, who have said to advisors, we'll only refer you work, we'll only pass things your way as long as you promise not to talk to the client or engage with them directly. From an authority position, this is not great. Obviously, if you can't engage with the client directly, you can't meet your code obligations. And so as this advisor correctly identified, you're not able to agree to not engage with your client. And I have just included two of the recent decisions we've had around this. And both of them have quite strong kind of guidance from the tribunal around, not engaging with your client directly, opens them up to fraud, exposes to scams, and it's just not an accepted practice. So kudos, good on that advisor for noticing that that's not the right thing to do, and hopefully everyone here is on the same page there. But I did just want to share that and give a little bit of a bit of authority input there. Now, the other thing we had the opportunity to do was to look through client files and inspect, and to have that face-to-face engagement interviewing with the advisors. And we did want to share a little bit of information around some areas that, we just think a bit of guidance might be needed in. First of all, who is the client? So we identified a little bit of a theme around especially accredited employer work visas, where you might in effect have two clients. And so, you're talking about maybe getting the employer accreditation and job tokens for the employer, and then helping them fill those job tokens and doing the work visa applications for the clients as well. So we did just want to talk about that situation and how important it is when you're representing more than one party who has the relationship with each other to really consider if there is a potential or actual conflict of interest there. Just a reminder, it doesn't need to be financial, so it can be anything where their interests may diverge at any point. And just a reminder that if there is a potential conflict of interest, there's a bit of a kind of process there. You need to declare it to the clients. You need to get their authority to continue to represent them. And also you do need to ensure that you are including it in the written agreement, as on the screen there for clause 19L. The other thing we noted was there are some advisors who are acting for multiple employees for an employer, and it might be that the visa types that they're looking at are exactly the same. And what we did notice is some group chats going on through messaging platforms where all the clients were included, and information around, your visa's been granted, here's your paperwork, were being shared in that group chat. And so just a key reminder around clause 4 of the Code of Conduct, you do need to ensure that you're only sharing information about your clients when they've given you written consent to do so. And that would include them being involved in a group chat with other clients as well and having their information shared in there. So just, a key learning for everyone who wasn't too sure about that. Just wanted to cover that off today. Now I'm going to quickly, because I don't want to take time from questions, but I am going to quickly move into a kind of two-part scenario. So what this is talking about is that situation that I referred to where you have an employer and an employee. So in this situation, the employer has engaged you to become an accredited employer. You've helped them do so. You've helped them obtain job tokens, and they have 4 people they want to give jobs to. So, you think, thank you for engaging me for this. Yes, I'd like to help. And the question here is, given you've done the employer accreditation and the employee is going to be working for that employer, is there a potential or actual conflict of interest here? So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to think about that, because I'm going to follow it up with a bit of a update to the story. Cool, and we'll move along, Tiki. Okay, so stuff has changed, and now you're preparing the applications for the clients. The employer has told you the 4 people they want, but then they contact you and say, actually, I only need 3 employees, and I'd like you to stop acting for client number 4, please. We don't need them anymore. The client hears about this from the employer and contacts you to say, well, actually, I've got a signed employment agreement with this, and I'd like you to continue to lodge my application for this job with INZ, please. And then same question as before, is there a potential or actual conflict of interest here? And the answer is yes to both. So I would encourage you, when you're considering conflicts of interest, to think about what could happen in the future if the relationship broke down or if the interests diverged. So here you have an employer who doesn't want the employee, and you have an employee who wants you to continue processing their application. And, that can put you in a bit of a difficult position as well. So I just wanted to cover those kind of 3 key points that, were top of mind for us as we reviewed the information from the trial. And now, as I said, I won't take up much more time, so I'll just pass over to the questions and answers segment of this. Great. And I think, Duncan, are you doing that one?
Thanks, Katie. I'm back. Yeah. Thank you for talking through the content and observations from the proactive inspections, Katie. I think, like I said at the start, it's really, really good bit of work that I'm pleased with the early results that we've found, and really, really appreciative of the contribution from the team here, Katie, including yourself and the authority, but also advisors who participated in that as a pilot. When I say I'm pleased, there's a bit of work to do to unpick some of the results and some of our findings. As Katie's highlighted, there's early observations that there's some room for improvement in the industry that we have identified, and we're going to work that through as a team, work that through the Immigration Advisors Authority reference group as well, and with a view to rolling that proactive inspection approach out more broadly in the new financial year. So thank you very much for sharing that. Also want to acknowledge, Tiki, your presentation just before. I thought that was a really informative walkthrough of our expectations around written agreements. I hope that's been helpful for those of you that are present today, and also those of you that watch this after the live event. I think it's important to have really clear, robust discussions and agreements in place with clients, and acknowledge that it can be a little bit tricky for advisors where you're dealing with multiple parties in terms of the migrant employer or whoever else it may be. But again, hopefully the content today has helped you improve your knowledge and understanding, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar and navigate this very well as an industry. I'll just highlight before we come to some of the questions that we've got published. So there is the ability to vote up the questions. So if you look at the Q&A function, you can see the questions that have been posted. There's a little vote button. So ticking that or clicking on that will help us to prioritize some of the questions that you as attendees today really want to hear. If you're of course not watching this live, then you don't have that opportunity to hear answers to the questions that you're really screaming out for, in my words. I will share, we've answered quite a number of questions directly live as the conversation has been going, so thank you to the team that's helped with that. A couple of the key themes that I've picked up, just for everyone who's attending benefit, a lot of questions around who is the client, working with multiple parties, and I think the content today has covered that and covered our expectations for how multi-party agreements are clarified, managed from a conflict of interest perspective, and managed from a written agreement perspective. We also had a handful of questions looking for a written agreement template. I acknowledge that's not a resource we provide as the Immigration Advisors Authority. We're quite clear that written agreements need to be bespoke or unique, or reflective of each client and the unique circumstances that they, or unique set of services that they may wish to commission. So therefore, we're not looking to provide a generic template, if I call it that. We do have a whole bunch of helpful resources on our website in the Advisor Toolkit, including a bit of a checklist to help you with your written agreements. And if that's of use, I really encourage you to look at the Advisor Toolkit on the iaa.govt website. It's all there. And look, if you need a bit more support, this is where, we've got several really helpful industry associations. They're there to help support immigration advisors. If you're not a member, encourage you to potentially look to join those types of forums, or if you are a member, there's maybe services that are or could be provided by that organization. Really encourage you to reach out to those sorts of resources if you need a bit more support. So we've got quite a few questions here that have come through, and what I'll do is I'll pick on the ones that have come through earlier in the session and look at the ones. Looks like we've got a few thumbs up on some of them, so thank you for highlighting some of these. The first question I've got here, we've got one from Andrea, and I'll read the question out, and I think Chloe, you're probably best placed to answer this one. The question is, for immigration advisors who are also education consultants and applying for study offers for their clients, when would be the right time to put an agreement in place? And I won't read the rest of the question because it kind of stems from there, but Chloe, perhaps this is one you can help out with.
Kia ora. Thank you, Duncan. Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Chloe. I'm one of the senior technical advisors in the Immigration Advisors Authority. One thing I will say is that clause 16 of the code sets out a couple of provisions for initial consultations. And it does say that the requirements at 17 and 18 aren't required to be met if you're just at the initial consultation stage. But after that, all of the provisions about written agreements do apply. This is something that we could spend a little more time. I'd like to dig into this a little bit more and provide you with a more robust answer, but at the beginning or at the outset, that's where I'd direct you, is clauses 16 and 18 of the code. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Chloe. The next question that I've got before me that has the most number of votes, and you have to forgive me that working through Teams is a relatively new webinar tool for us, so the Q&A function is quite different to what we had in Zoom. But here I've got a question around payments in advance, and I think perhaps Tiki, you may be best placed to answer this one. The question is, for repayment in advance, how do you request payment without an invoice?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, happy to address that, provide some further details about that. So I think you've sort of got possibly multiple options if you want to request payment without an invoice when you're dealing with payments in advance. I think first and foremost, we spent today talking about written agreements and making sure that the payment terms there are clear, right? So as a starting point, that's what I'd suggest, is making sure that your client knows what you expect, right? If you think about what I said early in the webinar, when you expect them to pay you. Okay, so that is I guess a written piece of information that you're providing to your clients, telling them when you expect them to pay you. There's possibly follow-ups you could have, other written follow-ups in the form of an email, as an example. There is also perhaps, but I will stress that this hasn't been tested, so I couldn't tell you with certainty whether it's something that's acceptable or not, but some of you may have heard of pro forma invoices, and that may be something that you could potentially use when it comes to advance payments, but I will again stress that that hasn't been tested before the tribunal. So my suggestion would be, having a clear written agreement and following it up with any other form of written communication. Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Tiki. So the next question that picking out of this list has a reasonable level of interest is around minors being included in written agreements. I wonder, Jenny, perhaps this is one you may be able to cover. If not, we can defer to another team member. The question is, how about minors included in an immigration matter? Do they also need to sign the written agreement? I'm sure we've got Jenny here. May have technology issues. Perhaps, Chloe, this may be one that you can take.
Kia ora, thank you, Duncan. Yeah, it looks like we may have lost Jenny. I'm afraid this is another one that I'll need to dig into a little bit more for a more robust answer. The code does require that all parties to an agreement sign it, but I would like to look a little bit more into what that means for parties who are under 18. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. And I think good question. We can come back to that one after this session. I would expect that it would be the legal guardian of a minor who has appropriate, essentially legal authority to sign and agree on a minor's behalf. But we'll come back and clarify that one as part of our follow-up information. Now, bear with me. Oh, we've got another question around that. Sorry, you've got to bear with me as I scroll through a couple of the questions to make sure we're not covering the same ones. So I've got another question here, and Tiki, you may be best placed for this one around written agreements. In the written agreements, can we include the estimated timelines for the visa application process and a breakdown of charges based on each stage of the process? Question goes on to say, also, would it be appropriate to state that application preparation takes approximately 5 working days once all documents have been submitted by the client?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yes, I mean, I would encourage you, again, thinking about sort of what we've discussed today, to set as clear expectations as you possibly can. Yep. So if you are including, estimated timelines, I do think that's generally something that your clients are going to be interested in, right? People want to know how long things are going to take. I would say that if you do that, you definitely want to stress that it's an estimate. All right, so you don't sort of mislead with your expectations. But yes, I think that is certainly something that you can and I'd say are encouraged to include in your written agreements. And the same goes for the breakdown of charges based off of each stage of the process.
Thank you. So we've 2 minutes, so we've probably got time for 2 more questions. The next one I've got here before me, Katie, I think you may be best placed to cover this one. The question is, so from my understanding of the discussion today, any potential conflict of interest must be included in the SA already before signing. Can you confirm?
Yeah, so the one thing I would add on that is if it's kind of potential at the time you're signing the written agreement, yes, definitely. And ensure you're doing, clauses 5, 6, and 7 as well. And actually considering if you can act, getting that written consent, declaring it in writing, keeping it in your client file that you've done that, and also recording that in the written agreement. Now, I will just refer you back to what Tiki said as well around making sure that you're doing any changes in writing to your written agreement. So, if one does eventuate later, for example, you realize that you're acting for 2 clients in the same matter and that wasn't apparent early on because the second client came later, make sure that you are updating. So really, I think it's best to err on the side of caution here because, sometimes you can think, oh, these 2 people, they get along so well, nothing will happen with them. But think about the situation and the arrangement and, what could happen if it wasn't person A and B. So just make sure that you're considering that and that you're considering that from early on, including it in your written agreement if you are aware of it at the start. And if you become aware at any stage, update the written agreement, declare in writing, and get the consent to continue to represent those clients as well. It might be also that you have to declare it to both. So, you might have a pre-existing client who you've been acting for, and then the second one comes along, and that creates a potential conflict for the first. So, I know I've gone outside of the question here, but quite passionate about this area, and I know the tribunal is as well. So just make sure you're doing all that and then recording it in the written agreement or updating it.
Thanks, Kay. Very quickly, I'll just answer one last question, which is around, for a returning client, do I still need to explain my license status and prove to show when the client has communications with me all the time? I think it's a good question. I would note, look, the written agreement is in the code. The standard relevant standards in the code are pretty prescriptive around including your licensing details, and I would encourage, when in doubt, err on the side of caution. It doesn't take much effort to be transparent and disclose your license status and information, and I think, when in doubt, play it safe. Look, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it's been hopefully a really helpful session from my perspective. I think I want to thank my team for presenting today. I think you've done a really tremendous job. If you have any feedback for us for how we can improve, update, change our approach for delivering these webinars, including if you've got specific content ideas, we'd love to hear from you. We've got some channels there to give us some feedback via a survey. Also, just you can email through any feedback that you have. We love to hear from you. Thank you very much for your time once again for joining us. We will have information after the session posted in our next newsletter and on our website as soon as we can make that available. And for those in New Zealand, enjoy your evening ahead, and for those globally, enjoy your day, night, wherever you are, in whatever time zone. Make the most of it. Thanks again. Ka kite.